when we talked about who would be an ideal person to be the writer-in-residence this fall, there was unanimous excitement about the idea of Sid Schanberg, because he so uniquely combines experience in different worlds that are important to us. As many of you know, the School of Journalism has been aggressively developing an international program, and for graduate students, we are hopefully going to have as an expectation an opportunity for every graduate student international experience, and Sid Schanberg has been a great international reporter. We also think of ourselves as a school which is at the forefront of looking at new media and online, web, wireless media and the rest, and Sid Schanberg has been at the forefront of working with new media. And we also had the good fortune that his last employer, though it was not everybody's good fortune, met an untimely end just in time for us to invite him to come spend a couple of weeks with us here. I had thought about introducing Sid by showing you a film, and for those of you who want to see it, we'll have it in the Annenberg Resource Center. If you want to see the entire film, there is a wonderful movie of which his replica is the star, called The Killing Fields, which is a story of based on Sid's work in Cambodia. But I thought, as I looked at it, Sid, that you were so much younger at that time, or Sam Waterston was so much younger in playing Sid Schanberg, that people might not imagine the person that they were about to see. But it was one example of the heroic and exciting and truly important exploits that a journalist can engage in. It is truly my pleasure to have on the campus and to have as our speaker this afternoon, wonderful journalist and a remarkably accomplished gentleman, Sid Schanberg.
Apropos of what Jeff Cowan just said, there was a time when I returned to Cambodia with the people who produced that film, and it was shown for the first time there. And there was a question period afterward, and somebody got up and said, you got older. I said, yeah. No, I said, Sam got older, I didn't get older. Anyway, I'm going to talk. It looks like I've written a lot here, so I don't know how much time there's going to be for questions, but I think that we should, I mean, I like the idea of a question period, so let's plan for one. Sinclair Lewis once expressed puzzlement over why people would want to come to hear writers give lectures. He finally concluded that the motive in coming was to find out, quote, if we were as funny to look at as we are to read. In that spirit, I've tried to inject some lightheartedness, some fun into my talk today. First, it's the conventional wisdom that one should begin every speech with a little joke, just to ease the awkwardness and get everyone relaxed. My joke tonight involves three men who die at the same moment and therefore find themselves standing together at St. Peter's gates seeking admission. Two of them are doctors and one is an HMO manager. St. Peter says to them, identify yourselves. The first doctor steps forward and says, I was a pediatric surgeon and I helped correct deformities in children. St. Peter says, you may come in. And the second doctor speaks. I was a psychiatrist, he says. I help people rehabilitate themselves. St. Peter says, waves them in also. And then the third man comes forward and says, I was an HMO manager. I helped people get low-cost medical care. St. Peter says, you can come in too. And as the man walks past, St. Peter leans over and says, but you can only stay 3 days. After that, you can go to hell. On the surface, that story has nothing at all to do with journalism. But then perhaps there is some connection. Maybe it's a metaphor for the troubles journalists are having these days getting any respect. We'll come back to that later. What I'm going to talk about first is my brilliant 11-month career on the Internet. A lot of people thought it strange that a traditional journalist like me, 4 decades of a good life doing basic shoe leather reporting, would move over to the cyber world. Why did I make the move? Well, the decision had a lot of parts to it. For one, traditional newsrooms have changed a great deal. Fluff and entertainment were getting more and more space. Some of the fundamental ethical rules had been tossed out without any true debate or discussion within the profession. And we had begun reporting on the sex lives of public figures as though this was automatically a legitimate public policy issue. Some media organizations had reporters covering President Clinton's sex life full time. I guess you could call this new position the sex beat. It's new, it's hot, and you better get jiggy with it. The old guideline, how quaint it seems now, was that you didn't write about a government official's private world unless you could demonstrate convincingly that it had a significant effect on the American public or on policy. I still believe it's a sound rule. The explanation that newspaper editors and proprietors give for abandoning it was that they had no choice but to follow the herd. They said that cable TV, shock radio, the Internet had together created a 24-hour news cycle with no respite, and they had to keep up to compete. This was the devil, they whimpered, that made them do it, made them lower their standards and relax their vigilance about what is allowed to go into the paper. But that was only one reason for my move. I saw the Internet sprouting upward and outward and sideways, and for a brief while, I was one of those people who groused and muttered that this newfangled thing would never last. It was a flash in the pan. Newspapers would still be the bulwark of serious journalism. Well, they still are, even in their changed or diluted state. But I could see that the Internet wasn't going to go away either. It was going to keep on growing and taking on new shapes. So when a reporter friend, Mark Sauter, called me out of the blue and told me he had co-founded a website named apbnews.com, which was then only 7 months old, and he said, "Why don't you come over and look at our newsroom and tell me what you think?" I accepted the invitation. My inner voice told me that this could be my next adventure. I had a choice to make. I could stand in the sidelines playing the grumbling dinosaur, or I could take a leap into this new thing and find out what it was all about. I took the first step. I took the subway down to Maiden Lane in Silicon Alley, down by Wall Street, and I walked into the APB newsroom and saw quickly why the New York City Fire Department had declared it a fire hazard and ordered the violations immediately corrected. 20 people and their computers were jammed into a room that in a civilized working space would have accommodated maybe 6 people. I had the eerie sensation that people were bulging out the windows, and they were all working a mile a minute, on the phones, on their keyboards, leaning over to swap information with colleagues, their elbows almost touching. I loved it. The air conditioning system was nowhere close to holding its own. Foreheads were misty with perspiration, wastebaskets overflowed. It was a real old-fashioned newsroom, except that in this one the reporters weren't puffing on cigarettes and stubbing out their butts on the floor. Apparently the fire department had scared them out of that hallowed tradition. The site was devoted to covering crime, safety, justice. APB stood for All Points Bulletin. Its slogan was, "You have a right to know." I told Mark and his partner, Marshall Davison, a successful New York stockbroker out of Texas, that I was impressed by what I'd seen, but that I didn't think stories about garden variety crime would hold my interest very long. However, for some time I'd been writing about the broader issues of white-collar crime, government corruption, ethics, and conflicts of interest. And I said if they wanted to broaden APB's reach into those areas, I'd be intrigued. We started a dialogue, and a couple of months later I joined the website as its editor for special investigations. Obviously, I was the oldest person in the room. The generational gap was a chasm, but it worked. The young people came to me for my historical memory, my experience, my advice on stories. I got them to teach me the tricks of cruising and researching on the internet, and I fed off their youthful energy. The editors were strong newsmen with solid and demanding values, but given their workload in 12-hour days, they didn't have much time for counseling or guiding the staff. By default, then, I got the gratification of serving as the newsroom mentor. It was a very civilized place to work, and civilized newsrooms are hard to come by. Competitive, sure, but very little backbiting or sniping, and a heap of good, solid journalism that won recognition from the mainstream press. APB received awards, surprisingly, for superior work from such groups as the National Press Club and Sigma Delta Chi. Surprisingly, because this was the first time a website got such awards. Did I come to master the technology and the cyberspeak while at APB? Nowhere near it. But I'm a lot more comfortable and a lot less intimidated by all the gizmos than when I started. Were there some generational and cultural issues? Yes, some. A number of the techies and computer wizards I found didn't have much to say to ordinary humans. Some of them seemed to think that those raised outside the digital religion were overweighting their world with pressures of commerce and profit, and therefore really shouldn't be allowed entry into internet society. I kept chipping away at their reserve, though, and trying to convey my own pure motives. Sometimes in an admiring voice, I would wander over to their desks and ask them where they got their nose rings or the funky hats several of them were used to wear while working. At the end, I think they softened enough to remove me from the assassination list. All told, it was a very good idea for a 65-year-old to jump into the internet stew, to join a work family that shared hardly any of his history or demography, and to discover this family to be only rarely exasperating, mostly interesting, often fun, and even more frequently than one had a right to expect, warm and loving. There were other benefits too, such as the free lunches at least once a week, which I never got in any of the other newsrooms where I worked. Of course, there was a benefit for the APB bosses in this gift. It not only kept morale up, but it kept the staff from going out to lunch, thus remaining chained to their desks to produce the heavy volume of copy that was needed to, quote, feed the beast every day. That was the name we gave to the constant grind of keeping the site updated and fresh with new stories. There were constant surprises. Where else but in a web newsroom would someone, in this case a technical supervisor, send an email addressed to the entire staff seeking personal advice as follows, quote, "Does anybody know of a good body piercing shop? One that's safe and isn't too expensive? Please let me know." My mentoring skills were of no value here. APB produced a healthy measure of serious stories and in-depth investigations, but the editors and proprietors soon found from our daily surveys of the electronic visits to the site that certain kinds of stories drew the greatest number of hits. Stories with a sex theme, that won't surprise you. The more bizarre, the better. Stories about animals, better yet, stories about animals that are abused or killed. One of our biggest successes was the story about the University of Wisconsin senior who killed his friend's parrot in the fraternity microwave oven because he was angry at an email the friend had sent. The story said as follows. Members of the Sigma Chi, our story, the APB story, members of the Sigma Chi fraternity made the grisly discovery last Tuesday in the dining room when they heard screeching noises coming from the appliance. The 1-year-old Quaker parrot exploded before they could free it. Every time there was even a minor development in this case, we ran a story, each time drawing unusual reader interest. The coverage spanned an 8-month period, from May 1999, when the parrot was microwaved, until December, when the perpetrator, who was son of the football coach, was sentenced, pleading nolo contendere to charges of cruelty to an animal resulting in death. Another charge called theft of movable property. He was given 10 days in the county jail in order to do 250 hours of community service, donate $1,000 to the County Humane Society, and continue the psychiatric counseling that was prescribed for him right after he killed the parrot. While I've got your attention about what keeps the internet humming, let me quickly tell you the story of Big Mama. Yes, that was her name. Big Mama was a 50-pound halibut that was stolen from a hatchery this year. You may recall the story because it happened in California, in Redondo Beach. Big Mama, who was 20 years old, was a brood fish that produced millions of eggs several times a month. She was a favorite of school children and others who visit the facility. The police arrested a man and woman saying they were low-level street thieves who stole the fish to sell the meat. Neither Big Mama nor her carcass was ever found. Being a crowd favorite, Big Mama's death caused a lot of bad feeling in Redondo Beach. John Skipper, this was part of our story, John Skipper, who's a police lieutenant, told APB News, quote, "This is a beach community with a lot of boaters and fishermen. This has pissed everybody off." APB got a lot of mileage out of Big Mama. I used to tease the editors about their predilection for running these stories of a bizarre nature, like the one about the fellow in a southern state who was arrested for bestiality. This guy broke into tears as he testified at his trial that he really loved the sheep and wouldn't have done anything to hurt them. My editors took my ribbing well, even as they winced. And then they would pull their survey sheets out of a drawer and show me how time after time the weird stories were driving the site, while the serious stuff languished way down on the reader's preference list. It's a lesson all of us in the business have learned before. And investigative reporting, in-depth reporting, have always been poor cousins, sometimes stepchilds in newsrooms. There are several reasons. One, long-term projects cost money, more money. Reporters have to be detached for months at a time to bring such projects to fruition, and personnel costs are the biggest chunk of any newspaper's expenses. When a staff is primarily given over to grinding out simple, basic daily stories rather than the special stuff, this isn't better journalism, quite the opposite. But it's easier, cheaper, and most readers may not be aware of what they're missing. Also, investigative projects stir controversy, rattle cages. And often these cages are occupied by people in high places, big advertisers, investors, government officials. In short, people the publisher would rather not offend. So there you have it. Two very solid reasons why the serious stuff has rarely been an honored guest in most newsrooms. The difference at APB was that the proprietors wanted to do the good stuff. The only hitch was that money was limited, and just putting out the daily breaking stories was eating up most of the budget. Producing original content, even the basic stuff, takes a good deal of money. The key word is original. It takes less talent, energy, etc. if you're mostly rehashing and repackaging other people's stories. That's what AOL does. It's what MSNBC does, and lots of others. But because APB's proprietors and editors wanted to shoot higher, they wanted to do both the basics and the special stories, they created an investigative capacity, which consisted of myself and two gifted computer research journalists. Even though the work of this unit was going to be much more costly per story, APB wanted the aura of specialness that it conferred. There are some things we do for our professional pride. They don't necessarily make money, sell newspapers or websites, but they make us feel good about what we do, and that's why they're important. And then this past spring, suddenly all of this came to a halt, or at least a near halt. While the proprietors were in the midst of raising another round of investor funds, the stock market went south. especially the internet sector, and even more especially dot-coms like APB that are based on original and therefore costly content. The result was that investors pulled back. APB quickly ran out of money, and in June, the site filed for bankruptcy, having spent in about 2 years $27 million and run up another $8 million in outstanding bills. Bankruptcy court is a nasty, shark-infested flea market. Smelling blood, the consultants and lawyers and bargain hunters descended. One of the bargain hunters, a company called Safety Tips, purchased APB for less than $1 million. And the new owners, somewhat surprisingly, are keeping the website alive, functioning in a kind of never-say-die limbo. It's being run by a strong skeleton crew picked from the original team on a daily basis with a handful of reporters and another handful of stringers. They're putting out a daily schedule of interesting crime stories and, from time to time, an exclusive special story or two. I check in on the website regularly to make sure it's still there. Just last Friday, before I left for Los Angeles, I logged on, and sure enough, there on the home page, the front page, among the top stories of the day was one of those wild crowd pleasers with sex and frozen semen and prison guards all in the first sentence. It read, quote, "In what may be the first case of its kind, 2 federal corrections officers have been charged with accepting bribes to smuggle cryogenic sperm kits into the federal prison at Allenwood, Pennsylvania, so that convicted felons who are barred from receiving conjugal visits could send out the semen to impregnate their wives and girlfriends on the outside." That was the lead. So you see, nothing has changed at All Points Bulletin, thank goodness. In fact, I myself continue to get emails from faithful readers who don't realize that all of us are not still at our APB desks. Here's one that came in the other day from someone who's perfect for the new owner's Safety Tips. This man wrote, quote, "I have some credit card-sized stun guns, real nice units and perfect for the ladies, and also some tri-pack pepper spray sets that I'm trying to sell. If you or anyone you know would be interested, please reply to this email. Thanks for your time and pardon my interruption." So what did I take away from my cyber world odyssey? I can report that the internet is a working organism where one can do research very quickly all over the world, but that as yet it's something short of nirvana for journalism or serious reporting. For example, when you're gathering all these data and documents, you need to be sitting on your fanny in front of your computer screen, having no personal contact with the actual people involved in the story you're researching. And your editor, knowing you have this encyclopedia at your fingertips, somehow wants the story on his desk much faster than he did before the internet was born. The best journalism needs lots of ingredients, tons of facts and detail, yes, but also it needs decoding. What do all the facts mean? If the facts suggest acts of wrongdoing, don't you have to go to the scene whenever possible and explore the terrain and talk to the people and sniff out the nuances? You can trip and stumble badly if you don't do this shoe leather journalism. No electronic invention, no matter how useful or revolutionary, can do this for you. The writers of too many stories on the internet, stories full of so-called analysis and criticism, produce these sagas without ever leaving the room. At APB, young reporters would confide to me their misgivings that they were missing something by being frozen at their desks. They wanted to get out more, to make human contact, to experience the living organism that was the city on the street below. With the APB staff now reduced to a handful, some of these young reporters have returned or simply shifted to newspapers, regional papers. Their work doesn't yet reach a national or global audience as it might on the internet, but they're getting back some of their journalistic skills on the street. And, oh yes, their shoe repair bills are higher. In short, the internet is like most workplaces. For every upside, there's a downslope. All of us have been told time and again that the computer age would give us more time for ourselves. Yes, it has allowed us to do more things than we could manage before cell phones and laptops and refrigerators with artificial intelligence. But it has also created more things for us to do. Yes, we're producing more, but more what? More disposable items or more memorable stories? Are we more thoughtful or wise with all this additional information around? Do we have more time to think through our problems and challenges, which surely have not become any less complicated? As always, it depends on how we use our new toys. As a reporter, I don't think I can offer any definitive predictions about the future of journalism on the cyber highway. I haven't done all the shoe leather yet. More important, these are very, very early days for the Internet. It's literally being invented day by day on an ad hoc basis at websites all over the world. No one can possibly know or even attempt to foretell at this point what shape or personality it will have even 2 years from now. It's morphing and shape-shifting as we watch. Of course, watching things morph and change at times dramatically is the lifeblood of reporting. If change were outlawed, reporters would either be unemployed or they'd have to make things up, which, as we know, is what a lot of people think we do. For myself, I've had a very lucky life. I had great mentors and guides, and I had lots of healthy competition from other newspapers when there were a lot of other newspapers around to sharpen our skills. I've seen more than my share of bad things here and in foreign countries, but I've been renewed also by the good I have found. My affair with journalism began on a United States Army newspaper in Frankfurt, Germany in early 1957. Named the Spearhead, it was the weekly paper of the 3rd Armored Division. I had applied for the job thinking it would be a softer touch than rooting around in the mud on maneuvers at my original posting in Butzbach. I was right, and I was also immediately hooked. I met real foreign correspondents for real newspapers covering the tensions and border incidents of the Cold War. When I first stepped into a bona fide newsroom in 1959 at the New York Times as a 25-year-old copy boy, I was suddenly in the company of groundbreakers in journalism who had covered the city and the world, reporters and editors who had witnessed the Great Depression, World War II, Korea. Edith Evans Asbury had been one of the first women to crack the gender barrier in mainstream journalism. Homer Biggert, with 2 Pulitzer Prizes, had covered the war in Europe and was also there at the Japanese surrender. These are the people, or some of them, who became my teachers. They were not household names. This was before the age of the journalist as a celebrity. But they were pillars in the profession, and they had time for apprentices like me. Some of this time that they had for people like me wasn't necessarily kindly or avuncular. In fact, it was more like hazing. One of my early assignments on Police Beat involved an accused spy named Sobel, who was related to the Rosenbergs. He had jumped bail and fled the country, leaving his car illegally parked on Manhattan's Upper West Side. My assignment was to locate the car and then to find his girlfriend, who was said to live in the vicinity. We didn't have her name or her address, just the location of the car. Great assignment. I could have used the internet that night. I finally found the vehicle. Across the street, 2 shady-looking guys were sitting in their car watching me. Obviously, FBI guys. I walked over and I asked them who they were. They refused to talk and waved me off. Being an enterprising reporter, I returned to Sobel's old Renault, which was locked, grabbed hold of one of the door handles and began yanking hard on it, trying to get a door open. The shady guys were on me in a flash. "Get away from that car," they yelled. I said, "Is it your car?" Nothing. Silence. I said, well, then it's my car. I've lost my keys. Get away from the car, one of them growled. I said, well, what authority do you have to give me orders? He said, we're FBI. And he showed me his credentials. All that work just to get him to tell me what I already knew. And then it wouldn't tell me a single blessed other thing. So I went off in search of the mystery girlfriend. At random, I chose an apartment house, a four-story brownstone, 2 apartments to a floor. I started at the bottom. I'm a reporter from the New York Times. I'm looking for a friend of Howard Sobel. That was my speech at each door. The replies within all came back wary and negative. Not one door was open. Finally, on the top floor, I ran out of enthusiasm. It happened when I knocked on the last door, and a woman with a frightened voice shouted at me to go away. I don't know any spies, she said. I tried to slip my press card under her door to show her I was legitimate. She kicked it back. Get away, came her banshee shriek. Well, night had fallen, and with all her screaming, I got worried that someone in the building might call the cops. So I got out of there pretty fast. And having no more stomach for this hopeless trick-or-treat escapade, I went back to the office. As I entered the newsroom, I was met with a burst of sarcastic applause and cheering from the rewrite men and the rest of the late crew. It seems that the woman on the 4th floor had phoned the paper, got passed to a rewrite man, and told him that someone named Sidney Schanberg, who was, quote, posing as a New York Times reporter, had tried to break into her apartment and rape her. The rewrite guy, Doug Robinson, assured her that no one by that name was employed by the New York Times. That's the kind of skill gathering you can neither teach nor learn in journalism school. Anyway, with caring gruffness and trial by fire, I think it's now called tough love. My mentors gave me my ethical compass and my code and let me see their stratagems, their reporter's tricks. They taught me about mission, about what was expected of us, what we owed the public, how fallible we were, how dogged we had to be in search of every possible detail, how crucial it was to make sense of the details for ourselves before we could draw the picture for the reader. Some years later, it became my turn when I came back from Asia and became city editor with over 100 reporters and editors on my staff, all of them wanting and needing advice or approval or a raise. Later at Newsday, where I was associate editor as well as columnist, my experience was much the same. I kept my office door open. I roamed the newsroom every day. I came to understand how important the teaching process was, how necessary it was not only to critique, but also to confer affirmation for good work. You have to keep remembering how fragile you yourself were in your early stages. I wouldn't want you to think that I did this as a saintly duty. You get back as much as you give, usually more. The exchange keeps you energized. So I guess if you sum it up, I would say that journalism has taken me on a grand tour, and it's still taking me there. It carried me to New York's capital, Albany, to cover Nelson Rockefeller, and then to India to become deeply fond of a paradoxical country that manages to cherish democracy while facing profound poverty and overpopulation. Later, I became possessed by the war in Cambodia and the genocidal aftermath that war produced. And then I came back to America to observe, as city editor, such things as the cooling of the idealism of the civil rights era. I moved on to become a columnist on the Times op-ed page, where my reporting apparently stepped on some big New York toes. A little over 4 years after I initiated the New York column, it was abruptly discontinued. It wasn't a great day for me or, in my opinion, for the First Amendment, but I understood. I resigned. The column, however, lived on at another New York paper, Newsday, and its recent offshoot, New York Newsday. both papers being pieces of the Times Mirror Company. I spent the next decade at Newsday until 1995, the year we all met Mark Willis, then the newly named chairman of Times Mirror, who has since left his legacy on both coasts. I interviewed Willis in 1995 when he shut down New York Newsday in order to boost the price of Times Mirror stock. He struck me as a smart and decent man who had totally deluded himself into believing that you could run a newspaper the way he had run a regional Federal Reserve bank in Minneapolis, and then helped run a cereal company in the same city. After writing a couple of columns critical of the shuttering of New York Newsday, I resigned from Newsday. Clearly, I was developing a pattern of being unable to hold down a job. The next few years were spent writing magazine articles and carrying on a quixotic effort to change the way the press covers itself, the goal being to raise standards and get back some of the profession's lost self-esteem. In a nutshell, I went to the editors and executives of major magazines and television networks and newspapers to posit the notion that we should cover ourselves the way we cover all the other institutions of power and influence in America, with the same level of resources, energy, and spirit of reform. We should bring our readers and viewers in by demystifying the profession and let them see that we are fallible and we make mistakes, and maybe they would find a commonality with us. Most of these media leaders were quite polite to me and said it was a fine idea, but somehow each of them came up with some pesky reason why they couldn't take it on. My favorite response from a major league newspaper was, quote, "We don't have the right person to do it," which I suppose means that they're never going to find the right person to do it. I wasn't really surprised by the turndowns. Actually, I expected it. On the subject of revealing our processes and decision-making, we don't behave much differently than the institutions we do cover. No newspaper is eager to acknowledge its own deficiencies or expose those of its peers who might return the favor. Everyone has dirty linen. My point, however, is that the press is different from other powerful institutions. It calls itself the nation's watchdog. You're not much of a watchdog, though, if you don't watch yourself. To bring this resume up to date, following my long march of windmill tilting on about journalism standards, along came apbnews.com. And now, here I am at USC, something called writer in residence. Another new thing for me. Who knows? Maybe it's the start of my next adventure. You know, Hollywood, here I am. Anyway, that's just meant to get you to ask questions and bring up some subjects that are dear to me. So I hope you will.
Lauren Giglione, the director of the School of Journalism, and a man who owned a paper in the place that you didn't mention, said in your wonderful remarks you skipped over the Clinton item in Clinton, Massachusetts, in a state where Lauren owned the newspapers of about the same size. Lauren will moderate this discussion.
Well, I just think we should turn to the audience and get questions.
Because this is being...
Okay, here. And I'll stay over here and work this side of the room.
If I wanted to look at the journalism for which you won a Pulitzer Prize, I could walk up the sidewalk to the library and there'd be microfiche or some version of it stored, and hundreds of universities and other civic libraries would have that stored. The fine work, or the best work that you did at apb.com, would that be easily accessible or equally accessible and archived? And do you worry about that for other online journalism outlets?
It's a good question. One of the things I liked a lot about the internet was that as long as your website was alive, the material stayed there. And it didn't die. People would communicate with you about your copy, just like letter writers write to you on a newspaper, months after the story was first posted. So I like the idea that it was there. I really haven't given a great deal of thought to what to do with the archives of websites that fail, that go dark. I know just for myself, I saved all the things I cared about. That's really, I mean, that's really the most, in other words, when your place goes down, I don't think you're really, you worry about the immediate things. But I think it's a serious question, and I honestly, we would lose a lot. I don't think there is I mean, I don't even know the answer to the question, is there a central archive where you can find this stuff if a place goes cold? And I don't know the answer. So that just shows you there are a lot of things I still don't know about the Internet.
There was a question over here. Any?
Bryce?
Yeah, here, let me give you this.
This is also, since you covered Albany, could you give us a brutally frank appraisal of one of the most interesting politicians in America, Nelson Rockefeller?
Nelson was a very intelligent man who had overcome dyslexia, literally, and turned into a man who could memorize huge chunks of policy material. He was a terrific campaigner. No one knew whether he was, there was a debate about whether he was a liberal or a conservative, and I think really he was a conservative liberal or a liberal conservative, something like that. It sounds like George Bush, right? He was a conservative with compassion. A friend of mine who did some wonderful reporting in his time and who died before his time, Bill Farrell, who also covered Albany, once said that Nelson Rockefeller was a true Democrat because he was arrogant and overbearing to everyone regardless of creed, color, or national origin. There were times if you crossed him when he would say, what's wrong with you? At a press conference, if you asked him a really aggressive question, and I was prone to do that, as was Farrell, and then you find yourself, as you do in most press corps, standing all alone with nobody offering a follow-up question, and you're there singled out, the guy who's taking on Nelson. And after this particular press conference that I'm remembering, he came up to me and said, you must be new here. I said, it's my third year, Governor. It didn't get any better after that. But I admired him. I must tell you, I didn't agree with a lot of things that he had believed in. And there's still some wreckage and legislation left over from his administration, like draconian drug laws in which people spend 20 years for carrying around a small amount of, Benzedrine, and they're still in jail. And he was really misguided about that because there was never much rehabilitation going on. It was just incarceration. But in any case, I admired his ability to recognize how to get things done and then to use his power. And of course, a man with that much money and with his family history, he had power just by his presence in a room. He was able to do things, get projects going. He would make like 3 telephone calls. He would call his bank. He would call his architect, Harrison and Abramowitz, and then he would call the head of the Construction Trades Council and to get by all the union and labor problems. And suddenly, within a few months, there'd be a project underway, some grand scheme he had developed. And it was a bit Robert Moses-like. So I had a very mixed feeling about him. I thought he was quite human. He had Bill Clinton's problem. He loved women all the time, and that's not against the law, but it can cause certain perception problems. But it did make him human, and I guess I could go on telling Nelson Rockefeller stories a long time, but I don't think I. There's a question here. Right.
I'm curious as to what you see are good investigative journalism sources, either on the internet now or in traditional media.
Well, the major papers all now have. I mean, the papers that aspire to being national papers, like the Washington Post and the New York Times, obviously. And I guess the LA Times, except the LA Times probably suffers from something that's beyond its control, and that's the time zone. And, you know, to be a national paper, by the definition that I don't necessarily accept, but that is usually given to it, is that you have to have an impact on the centers of decision making. That means Washington, among other places, and the LA Times stuff, you know, comes later than the other papers. And just by being across the country, there's a real elitism about on the East Coast, and they cherish their primacy, even though they may not earn it all the time. And East Coast media do not pick up as many stories, as many good stories from the LA Times as they would if those same stories appeared in the New York Times or the Washington Post. But I digress. I mean, I don't see anybody outside of the major newspapers trying to do truly in-depth reporting. There are magazines that will commission people to do things, and it's a from time to time thing. But I think it only has an impact, sadly, when it comes from the big organizations, and they're not spending the money on that kind of thing. Certainly television is not. Television is reducing its actual full-time staff. It hires freelancers more and more often now. And that raises the question of how high the quality is. Investigative journalism is a phrase I'm uncomfortable with, even though I have used it. It's because it's simply good journalism. I mean, that really is all it is. And there are many kinds of it. There's the kind that focuses on documents, and documents are wonderful. It's very hard for a public figure or a government official to get away from your question if you can then push a piece of paper across the desk and say, yeah, but what about this? I mean, it's hard to get away from a document that's official and can't be put down. So documents are important, and some people are very good at it. And the Internet's a great place to find documents. It's not just it's not just some media site on the web. A lot of the investigative stuff that we've been doing, that major organizations have been doing in recent years, has been of a prurient quality about people's private lives, and the press hasn't looked very good doing it, and has thrown up its hands and said, we can't help ourselves, everybody else is doing it, we have to be competitive. But the press has to recognize that when you go looking through keyholes, all the fancy words about the First Amendment and doing it in the public interest and contending that you're covering the character issue, all of that baloney that people in the media spout in their embarrassment over doing this stuff won't stop the outcome, which is that the reporter, the news organization gets tainted along with the person who's sinned. And we're pretty tainted these days. We're carrying a lot of baggage, and that's one of the real problems, I think, in the industry today. It isn't that we're doing it this moment. We've sort of relaxed on Bill Clinton. I don't think we have a 24-hour watch on him now. But I think I'd be willing to make a very strong bet that the next time any senior public official gets into that kind of trouble, that the press will be all over it again, and with the same excuses. So I just think that investigative journalism, I don't think, is having any particular heyday, and I think that reporters have to fight for it themselves, and it's not an easy concept if your editors don't seem friendly and your proprietors don't want to spend the money on it. But I really do think that that's nobody can abdicate. I've always said to other reporters, if you want to get the story in, you've got to fight for it. You've got to keep going back. You've got to make a pest out of yourself. We are vacuum cleaner salesmen. That's one of the things that we do. We go up, we walk up the steps and we ring the doorbell and we ask people to talk to us. We have to earn their respect, but we also have to ring their doorbells. And in the newsroom, we have to ring the doorbells of the editors, and we have to just keep persuading and persuading and persuading them that this good stuff has to be in the paper. It will bring us prestige and a certain amount of honorability. Yes.
Report and others that they filtrate and unsubstantiated gossip. How do you perceive the internet as affecting journalistic credibility and the audience's perception of it?
I think it's a mixed bag. The Drudge is not representative of the internet. I mean, he's a guy he's got a gimmick. He's a terrific gossip reporter, and that's what he ought to be doing. And it should be labeled gossip or something else, and I mean something clearly less than news, and with a rubric that said this information may be dangerous to your health or something. Because, so I mean, but I don't worry about that, because I think it's quite clear that he's a performer, and that what his goal is to tweak the mainstream press, and every time that we get into a serious discussion with him, that he has a heyday. I don't think he's a danger. I think that we're the danger if we think we have to do any of that junk. He has got enough right in some of his stories to be taken half seriously. But the only thing you can do when his stuff comes up is simply you've got to just take it and check it out. You should never put it in the paper. And during the Monica Lewinsky thing, the mainstream press put a lot of it in the paper, saying the Drudge Report said, and they put it on page 1. And it doesn't matter how close he came to the truth. It was such a distorted kind of truth, and it lacked such context that there was no reason for a legitimate editor not to just take it and give it to a report that we're not running this until we can confirm it. There's nothing wrong with trying to confirm something. The answer is, it comes back from the editor, well, but my competitors will have that in the paper tomorrow morning on the breakfast table of their readers, and my breakfast tables won't have it. I'm sorry, I think you have to accept not having unconfirmed junk in your paper.